Hello, everybody, and welcome to Getting APIs to Work. Today, we say hello once again to Jason Harmon of Stoplight, your CTO there. Thanks for joining.
Thanks, Eric. Glad to be here. I'm a fan.
We have something API oriented, I would say, and we're going to talk about scaling API consistency. And I think it's a really interesting topic because, as we all know, there are more and more APIs, more and more APIs are getting designed. But it's also important the more you have that there is some level of consistency. So when you talk about consistency, what is your approach of even describing like what it is and why it matters when you look at APIs and API landscapes?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of folks talk about kind of the developer experience or the consuming side of APIs and consistency, which in simple terms is, if you're using a bunch of APIs that claim to be a platform, they should all kind of look and feel the same, right? I think where it gets trickier is for folks that have an often fuzzy mandate for like, let's drive consistency within the organization and get all of our API development teams to build things that look and feel the same. There's a way to break that down and think about it. That's a lot more complicated, right? So I think that's more the subject here.
Yeah, it's not something that you can just demand and then it'll happen, but it's really a question of how do you put the right mechanisms, I would say, in place to make it easy. And then also, what do you have to spend time with? I think that's another interesting subject there. And for, let's say, some of the things that are interesting, we did have quite a number of episodes already around Spectral. And I think Spectral has become something that people are very excited about. It's created by Stoplight, but it's an open source tool. And it helps you to get, I would say, kind of a baseline of consistency or to have some mechanical checks where you can already do quite a bit of work to achieve better consistency. How would you say Spectral fits into the, let's say, bigger picture of consistency?
Yeah, the last year's been wild with Spectral. I'll say that. Watching just the crazy growth. So as you know, I host a podcast called API Intersection, and we ask people a lot about what do you do to kind of govern your platform. And I'll tell you, like almost every guest, if it's not on the episode in kind of green room time, will bring it up. Like, hey, we're using it
Mm-hmm.
and we're taking a look at other stoplight stuff, whatever. Um, I think, in simple terms, Spectral's a linter, right? And developers know linters well, but it's a linter based on JSON, and I think that's part of the power of it is you can apply it to any schema, and we're seeing more ideas around using it on things like kind of data related schemas even. But where it's more commonly used is Open API and Async API. And we now have kind of stronger support coming together around Async API. We've got kind of a collaboration with that team where we've got kind of a more open dialogue and kind of given them some level of committing sort of the rule sets that Spectral uses to check Async API. But all of this is just to say, what purpose does that serve is taking the most boring aspects of reviewing an API, which is things like, is it spine case or is it, snake case? Does it uh, avoid certain acronyms? These kinds of basic concepts. There's a handful of built-in rules, and the rule sets are pretty easy to define if you use the built-in stuff. There's also custom functions, which provide a lot of complexity if you're good at JSON schema, or sorry, JSON path. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so yeah, that's kind of the gist of it. I think in the bigger picture of things, that doesn't solve for like, is this named well, right? It doesn't
Yes.
necessarily solve for, are you using common sort of schema or common interaction patterns around things like headers and query parameters? That's definitely another area that needs to be dealt with. But in my book, like, I don't know, easy 70, 80% of what you would sit down and do in reviewing an API if you're serving that function is the boring stuff. So the way we look at Spectral is, you know, uh, assuming you're doing API reviews, and if you're not, then do that, right? Have some check before things
Yes.
go out the door. Whoever has to do those things, let's take all the boring stuff away, right? No one wants to talk about the boring convention stuff. Let's have a discussion about why does this API exist? How does it fit within the bigger picture of of your platform? That's a far more interesting conversation and a lot more kind of time effective where API reviews don't become a bottleneck. So it's clearly emerging as the strongest way to kind of get that started.
Hmm. Since you're talking to quite a number probably of people who are using Spectral, I'm just wondering, I'm always curious, when tools become so useful and popular that they clearly are something valuable, you always have people who are kind of overextending the tool a little bit, right? And now say, oh, now I can solve every problem with the tool. Have you seen that? Have you seen somebody going like totally overboard and crazy and doing things where you then ended up saying, you probably don't want to approach that using Spectral?
I mean, there's definitely a lot of really cool ideas. I think where we actually end up accommodating a lot of things with Spectral is with it has this sort of custom functions capability,
Hmm.
and we try to watch closely on what people are using those for and figure out if do we need to promote those things to kind of a built-in rule. Um, I think there's some other ideas emerging around it and things like how do you sort of zoom in on things like complexity. Like, is this API too complicated in its design, right? Or looking at some kind of design quality scoring mechanism, things like this. So there's really
Hmm.
interesting ideas out there, but um, reminder: Stoplight's still a relatively small company, and there's a lot of bigger players involved with big, complicated needs. And I think we're definitely at the stage of starting to open up more. I mean, we have all the interest to be transparent, just putting the right structure around that so that we can, frankly, get more folks contributing a little bit more and sort of share some of that authority for what Spectral could do and have a better way for us to kind of agree on the roadmap going forward. But yeah, truthfully, I think we went and pulled in basically everything we could find on the internet that had been defined in Spectral and kind of built up like what rules were used most often and how often custom functions were used. And
Okay.
they're actually not used that often. So it's shocking how much you can do with the built-in rules.
Shocking in a good way, then, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Like we kind of expected, oh God, the custom function stuff is going to take forever to see what people are doing. And like it wasn't that bad. And a lot of it we looked and went, yeah, those are kind of obvious potential next things to add to rules.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
so yeah, I think we're only beginning to understand in the last few months why like it spread so fast in this last year as it covers
Yeah.
most of the things that people would think to do. So
That's pretty cool. I think it's a really good situation to be in. I think that you also, because that tool is open source, right? You get like such a broad user base that gives you really good insights into how to make it better. And I think that alone is probably also a nice side effect that you can have there.
yeah, I mean it's I know for me it's a unique situation sitting on an open source project that suddenly has grown so fast. I mean we've had last summer we had the Italian government adopt it and start defining rule sets for all their APIs. Earlier this year the UK government has a team now that's doing it. The number of like Fortune 100, Fortune 500s that are using it extensively internally that we've been learning about, it's kind of wild. Um,
Hmm.
so getting that kind of right transparency and governance around this open source thing is tricky for us for sure at this scale, but it's exciting for sure. And I think where we're looking at next is like uh, Open API, for example, or even async API, something like that. If you want to roll out something like that to a whole organization, one of the big barriers is how do you teach everyone how to use it? Right? That's potentially thousands of developers learning a complicated spec format. It's a barrier to progress. And so, for Stoplight, like making it where you don't have to know all that stuff is what kind of our studio experience has been about. And we've been looking at how can we make Spectral a little easier to use in that regard for folks that
Hmm.
don't have, that kind of in-house expertise to have all the JSON path foo it might take to do the advanced things. Um, So, that's another interesting facet for us too, is how
Hmm.
can we take the open source stuff that's cool for these kind of early adopter crowd and make it just easier to use.
Hmm. So if we zoom out a little bit, so Spectral, I think, really is like an important part nowadays, definitely of this consistency space. But you said these are the boring 80%, so to speak. I don't think they're always boring, but at least you can automate them, so that's good,
Well,
and
when
that's
you've
a
done it,
worthwhile effort.
when you've done as many API design reviews as I've done, that stuff's boring. You really get tired of looking at like, let me check. Well, and it's
Yeah,
error prone because it's human based, right?
yeah,
Like, if
yeah,
I have to look at every path and every parameter and make sure that everything follows all the different rules, I miss stuff every time.
yeah.
And like, it's just mind meltingly boring. So, yeah.
Okay, okay. Let's agree that it's boring,
Yes.
but okay. Then the other question then would be, so what are the not so boring parts, right? So we talked about
Yeah.
scaling, and I think, the boring parts being something that you can automate is great because that also, of course, makes scaling very easy. But then the question and also a little bit of the challenges, right? The non-boring part, what are these, and what would you say about the scalability there?
Yeah. Um, I mean, first I would touch on that, like, it's just a tool. And we have to remind folks of this with lots of things around APIs. It's like, yeah, Spectral's good, but it's not a silver bullet, right? It's not going to just instantly make everything consistent from a convention standpoint. Um, which, some of that is what are you doing upstream? Like, how early can you get this awareness? So things like there's a VS Code extension, which we recently updated to the latest version of Spectral that was stale, sorry. And then we actually just saw recently that there's now an IntelliJ plugin for it as well. I think this stuff's exciting because we've been hearing this from folks that are trying to roll it out internally at large organizations that it's great that you can check it in your CI/CD. It's great that you can, put some tooling around it and do some kind of API design review process. But all that's too late, right? Everything needs to go left. That's all we think about all the time is how far left can we be? And if it's integrated into your development environment, and certainly for Stoplight users, you get this kind of built in as well in our sort of studio experience. But you can use VS Code for just about any language these days that isn't Java. And if you're in Java, you're probably in IntelliJ. So I feel like we've kind of got a lot of the IDE basis covered now. And thanks to community contributors who publish that IntelliJ stuff. As I remember it, it's an IT group that helps serve like Lidl and some of the other European grocers. So really cool. I haven't had a chance to talk to them yet,
Hmm.
but so all of that is to say, before the review process, which we all think about a lot in terms of governance, is how can you federate and distribute that upstream of the review process? And the first step is get it into your developer tooling so that they're able to see these things and fix it themselves and not have to rely on someone else to run the magic tool. And
Hmm.
then the second bit is much squishier, which is it's not a tool. It's not just process. I think for me, it's the power of peer pressure, which is if I'm defining an API design review process, one of the things that I'm going to be pretty firm about is don't ask me to review an API that no one else has seen but your team. If you're the one building that API, right? I want to see that you've
Hmm.
talked to either someone that's going to use it or some neighboring domain who's familiar and has some subject matter expertise to have a cross check. And that sort of customer centricity of show it to whoever's going to consume it. And you can share an open API, and there's no risk. They're not going to integrate with the thing you haven't built, right? And
Hmm.
you can put a mock in front of it, right? I mean, like we have Prism as another open source option, but there's a million options for mocking.
Yeah.
So yeah, give someone a way to play with the thing before you build it, and then have neighbors look at it. And then by the time you get to that review process, chances are there's not a whole lot to deal with on that side of things. And again, you can come back to why does this exist? What is the capability? Is this reusable enough? Are there going to be scale problems in the way that it's implemented? Is it tested enough? Like that's all far more interesting stuff, right?
Hmm. Hmm. But these then, I mean, these are, I would assume, are relatively qualitative things then, right? Where you still want to make sure that you have them as early as possible, so to speak. But these probably will be much harder to address with some kind of automation or some kind of automated tooling that you can have.
Yeah, I mean that's uh, we're innately lazy as developers, right? And that's why I say like if
Mm-hmm.
you see boring stuff, automate it. But there's lots of things that are I think really fall more into this category of thinking of your APIs as products. And I would say think of
Yeah.
beyond API design is think about how you're designing your platform. And the difference between a bunch of APIs and a platform is primarily consistency. But the second factor is do these things make sense to a customer when they look at, or really to the integrating developer, that I know these things, right? I'm familiar with these
Mm-hmm.
concepts and they all make sense when I look at the list of them together. And that part you can't automate, right? That part you got to know the customer story, you got to know the job that you're trying to
Yeah.
do for them, right?
But I think you can still at least, improve on the process a little bit. So one of the
Mm-hmm.
things that we have been successful with sometimes is like for organizations, and we don't really impose any specific format, but to say do something like an API value canvas, or like something
Mm-hmm.
that just makes clear that you have thought through what problem is it approaching, right? Who is it built for? What is it supposed to do? That you have thought through these things, you've documented them, and then what we've seen also that this makes it much easier than to have the conversation, because it's like there's a structured way of how people approach it, and
Yeah.
then you can kind of pull these resources along with a design process, right? And say, okay, if you want to have a design review, you need to have some kind of canvas thingy, because that's how we conduct the conversation.
Yeah, on the API intersection podcast, the one thing we do every episode in general is ask like, okay, cool program, sounds complicated. What if I'm just getting started? Where would you start? And the most prevalent answer has been have a way to communicate, right? And we've sort of tried to use this term universal vocabulary, right? Have the
Mm-hmm.
terms that customers
Yeah.
would understand described, and some kind of a relationship between those terms, and that canvas. I like that word too. People will call it a vocabulary, a grammar, a taxonomy. There's a lot of different ways to describe this and different methodologies to produce it.
Oh
But
yeah.
I'll say like a marker board and a small group of people with the right knowledge, or Miro these days with more virtual, is probably the most effective tool I've seen. It's really about who you have and what the
Mm-hmm.
conversation is. But yeah, if you do that homework, when it comes down to that discussion of does this make sense in the portfolio of our platform, it's a lot easier discussion if you're all speaking the same
Yes.
language and a language that customers would understand.
Mm-hmm. No, I totally agree. So just out of curiosity, have you considered like pulling along more, let's say, design artifacts through the design process, like as something that you could have as part of this life cycle management, so to speak, right? Where you would say there's certain artifacts, whatever you call these things,
Oh yeah,
make sense to take along. Is that something that you've thought about, or I'm just
oh yeah,
curious here.
for sure. So we have some kind of earlier access kind of things at Stoplight for sure that aren't really prime time yet, but probably not that far out.
Okay.
I would say Stoplight aside, conceptually, um, the idea that there are certain things, certain entities or objects or models, however you want to call it, in your API that should be consistent across multiple APIs. My favorite example from my days at PayPal is something like a contact or an address. There's probably a globalization system that's going to do your address verification or storing contact information. So, for your own purposes internally, even if these aren't externalized APIs, every time you reference a contact or an address, you should have the same shape of an object to it, at least as a
Mm-hmm.
base that you maybe extend in certain scenarios. But that's applicable to usually not a huge group of things. But the developer experience improvement when you're using a lot of different APIs that all use the same kind of stuff, it's really nice because you're not having to learn a
Mm-hmm.
new way to interact with that, and you can make your kind of consumption code a little more efficient. But there's more than just models, and I think this is the part that people forget a lot is what I kind of categorize as like interaction patterns. So things like, what do you use headers and query parameters for? So an example being like, what are your paging controls? Is it previous, next? Is it limit, offset? Is it both? Whatever. But sort of codifying what those patterns are, um, and making sure that that's a shareable thing across those APIs as well. Or that, and frankly, there are ways to sort of detect this stuff and and sort of do it after you've designed. But the reality is, you have to be intentional with what those things are up front, and share those things across APIs. So yes, we think about it a lot. Yes, we've done things before, and bigger plans coming at Stoplight for sure.
These are really cool examples. I would like to just make you aware, because I don't know whether you've seen it, but like a little while ago, I had my good friends from the microservices API patterns talking about their project. And I think that goes directly in this direction, right? It's the same idea of there are certain API patterns that you can implement in various ways, but they give you like a certain design approach, I would say, to like, and it's a thing that gets repeated over and over again, and if you do it consistently, it's good. So yeah, no, that's interesting. So yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. Let's see
I mean,
what's
you
coming
could do
next.
some you can do some good on those things with Spectral in terms of like checking to make sure that people didn't do the wrong thing. So, for example,
Yeah,
if there's certain patterns you don't want to support, say you're saying we want to do previous and next for paging, we don't want to do limit and offset anymore. You can detect that and say don't do that. But you definitely need a better way to share those things. So yeah.
yeah. Okay, cool stuff. Thank you so much, Jason, for joining. I think it's really interesting to see where this is going. I'm sure we'll have another Spectral conversation in a
Hmm.
little while, because it's
Yeah.
it's still growing, and it's still pretty impressive to see that. So thanks a lot for joining.
My
Good
pleasure.
luck with yes, and good luck with your future Spectral and Stoplight journey, of course. And thanks
Thanks a lot.
everybody for tuning in. I hope you liked what you saw. If you did, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and bye, Jason. Bye, everybody. See you soon.